Hello and welcome to Critical Line Item. My name's Tom Ravlick. Thank you for joining me for this particular podcast. One of the biggest issues that has been debated in the context of media reportage in Australia of late is how the media reports extremist movements. The debate has ranged from a range of propositions, which is don't report anything at all, to uh, deplatform people from social media, to report particular events with a particular balance, and that's left a lot of people confused. Some of the some older generation reporters will report, but the way in which not the way in which extremists would like them to. But there's also younger generation journos who would argue that you do not platform extremists in any way, shape, or form. Now, someone who has experience in this space and whose view is particularly relevant is Jeff Schoep, the former leader of the National Socialist Movement in the United States, now the founding director of Beyond Barriers, an organisation that engages in helping people pull back from a life of extremism. Jeff joined me the other day. This is podcast number 2, and we're looking specifically at public engagement and media engagement, and how people should look at reporting what happens on the extremist side. Jeff, thanks for joining me the second time.
Hey, Tom, thanks for having me. It's an honor
Absolute
to be here.
pleasure. Now, look, let's turn the clock back a bit in this conversation. Um, when you first became a member of the NSM, there would have been a vibe or an attitude towards the media. So, how was the media viewed when you first joined the NSM? What was the vibe about it?
Well, as far as being involved in back in those days with the extreme far right, the media was not looked upon in a friendly way. The term, for lack of a better word, that term that was often used in the far right movement back then was it was monikered the name Jews media, basically. So, in the belief of the extreme far right, the Jews control the world's media and run that. So the idea of the movement of the far right movement was to try to manipulate and utilize or use the media to our advantage. And one of the things back then that I used to say when I was involved in this stuff was that the relationship between the media and the movement was that of and I don't even know if we can say this on the air, but it was like a pimp and a prostitute, basically, and that both were using one another. So that's basically the view on it.
Um, so the attitude towards the media was essentially aligned with the ideology of uh, the Zionist occupied government, Jewish dominance, and that kind of thing.
Yes, yeah, it was the media was considered like the enemy, but it was a necessary evil in some ways. From that perspective, was that we knew if we did provocative things or things of that nature, provocative rallies, provocative demonstrations, passing out leaflets that were getting on the news or things like that, that we would bring media coverage. And of course, the media coverage wasn't good. The media never sang the praises of the National Socialist Movement or similar groups. But our philosophy on that was that anytime we're able to make the news or get the organization in the news, every single time it resulted in new recruits joining, that there was from the and you have to put yourself in the mindset of the extremist, and the mindset of the extremist, as long as they're putting out something, as long as they're talking about the organization on the news, it's an opportunity to recruit, and it happened every time. In different situations where we did demonstrations and there was little or no media coverage, it also translated in little to no recruits in those specific instances going back. So there's a lot to be learned. A lot can be learned from this, and as far as manipulating the media or getting them to cover different events that we were doing, that goes back historically, at least in America here, it goes back historically, excuse me, historically to Commander George Lincoln Rockwell, who was the founder of the American Nazi Party. And he had said um, that with the swastika, they would break through the media blackout in the United States, like a shock and awe type of thing. So, by shocking the public and shocking the media, it brought attention to the National Socialist movement, or back in those days, the American Nazi Party, um, and that was the that's the gist of it.
What was your first interaction with the media back when you first began? Can you recall the first person you spoke to in the media about the ideology?
Oh wow, that's a good question. I don't know if I've been asked that before. I would say it was probably in the early it would have been in the early 90s, in the early 1990s, 93, somewhere around
Okay.
that time. I can't remember the exact like TV station or anything uh to that effect. There was a lot of coverage from starting in the early 90s and going forward, at least my time involved in it.
What do you recall of those particular earlier interactions? Because uh, you know, people learn to engage with whether it be the media or whoever in a particular context, in a particular framework. What do you recall of that?
Well, there's one particular incident that really sticks out if I look back on my interactions with the media. And this was also it would have been in the early 90s, or around 93, or around that 94 at the latest. But I had went on a radio show, and at that point I was not the leader of the National Socialist movement at that point. I was just a local organizer, and I was in the radio station with the former leader of the NSM at that point. And at that time, I was using a fake name. I was because my last name, Schoep, is not very common, and I didn't want my family to be targeted by people that didn't agree with the movement. So I was going into this interview, and I had explained to the radio show host. I said, my name's Jeff Stevens, which of course my name's not Jeff Stevens, it's Jeff Scoop. But I was trying to protect my family at the time, and was using Stevens as a fake last name during that interview. And I'll never forget this. But during that interview, I had said some things on the air that the radio show host didn't like. And there was people calling in that were supportive, and she didn't like that, and she was getting more antagonized and more angry as the show was going along. And at some point during that show, she got so angry with me, she like slammed her hand down, and she says, your name is not Jeff Stevens, it's Jeff Scoop. She spelled out my name on the air, Schoep. And I know, your mother is a German immigrant, your father lives in this town, works at this, basically, before the word doxing was being used, she basically doxed my family on the air and said she was going to call my mother at work during this morning radio show, and basically call in. And this was one of those things you look back, and I don't blame anybody else for the choices that I made over the years. But someone had asked me this once before. They said, early in your career in the movement, what if something like that didn't happen? Because when that happened, first thought in my mind at the time was defense of the family, because I knew that people could be, targeting my family after that. And basically I said on the air that I don't have any connection with my family. They don't love me. I was just trying to do damage control. I didn't know how this woman knew my name. It was very disturbing. And so I think she had it planned out in advance, and tried to cause a lot of problems for my family, and that the reverberations and what took place after that. And there's some things I really don't want to talk about um, on the air. But my family definitely paid a price for my involvement in this movement. But to summarize that, what I was going to say on that was her doxing my name on the air and doing that. It didn't deter me. Like a lot of people think, if you do stuff, if you dox people, if you target their families or things like that, they're going to back down. For me, when the things like that happened, I doubled down on my activities. I got more active. I got At that point, I was like, well, people know my name now. I might as well put it out there. And it was 27 years total, or about 25, 26 years after that happened, that I ended up staying in.
That is, it's an interesting sort of incident. When did after it? Did you do much media after that, or did you was the did you sort of ease off engaging with the media for a little while after that incident?
I don't think so. I mean, that was pretty shocking, but we were doing a lot of things at that time that were pretty provocative, like marching around in the local neighborhoods with swastika flags and uniforms and things like that. So I don't think it deterred me at all. It just made me really, really angry, and it caused a lot of damage to my family, which
Okay.
the family had nothing to do with my choices. They were actually they had been against it from the get go.
If we take that incident and look at the sort of the activism that um, drew attention, what were the things that you did publicly that you knew would always get attention from the media?
Back in the early days, like around that same time period, we had done things like the former leader of the organization showed me what he called the one man picket or the one man demonstration. And he said, we're going to go to downtown Minneapolis. He says, I'm going to be in uniform with the flag and a picket sign, or was one or the other. And I'm going to stand in front of this federal building and do a one man picket. I said, why are you doing a one man picket? There's three of us here. He says, because I'm going to show you this is how it's done. This is how it's done. And that was the start of how we were learning how to get the attention of the media and things like that. So that particular incident, I don't believe made the news, but there was one soon thereafter where we went to the state capitol. There was hearings about I think it was American Indian rights or something at the time, and maybe a gay rights legislation. So we were showing up at those things to oppose them, and basically just standing in the state capitol in the hearings with the a swastika armband on or in uniform, and that got media attention. That was a guaranteed media attention there. And then in South St. Paul, we were doing walking pickets with the swastika flag and things like that, and marching around with the group of people that we had at the time. And most of the time that was making, not every time, but that was making media and press, things like that at the time. That was in the 90s.
Did movements like the NSM also do sort of placards, posters, and flyers and that kind of thing? Did flyer campaigns get much in the way of attention, or were they simply dismissed?
No, the flyer campaigns and the leafleting campaigns often, not always, they didn't always make the news, but quite often they did. And we learned how to again manipulate the press. And I want to backtrack just a moment, because there was one more thing that I was thinking of. When that particular radio show where I said earlier that people were calling in and expressing that were in support of us, some of those people were people that we knew. Others were just random listeners from around the area, but some of them were people that we knew, and we knew how the radio uh talk show hosts were going to screen calls. So they would screen calls of the people coming in, and they said, well, why do you want to get on the air? The call screener's doing this. Why do you want to get on the air? And we would tell our people, tell them that you want to give the Nazis a piece of your mind, and that you're angry and you want to give these guys heck. So the screener thinks it's somebody that's against us that's calling in, and the moment they patch the call through to the person running the host, then the person gets on the air, it's live, and they said, hey, where's your website, or how can I get in touch with you guys? I'm a supporter, or I'm want to join. How do I do this? So this kind of thing was happening too, which was really getting under this talk show host's skin, because people were calling in, and she wasn't having a lot of callers that were angry with us. In fact, they were calling in support of us, and some of that was our own doing, of having learning to do these tricks, I guess you could say, or these tactics to manipulate the media. So back to your more the question on the flyers. So what we did on the flyers was something similar to this. So if we hit a neighborhood in the suburbs of Minneapolis, or Minneapolis, St. Paul, wherever, at the time, we would make phone calls and pretend to be an angry person from that neighborhood. So we'd have one of the females call up and say, I live on 22nd Street, and this National Socialist movement put a flyer on my car. Why aren't you guys covering this? This hate group is in our area, and we're tired of it. Our neighbors are mad. We've got kids at home that are angry, this sort of thing. So we'd have people calling in pretending to be angry residents, and then the reporters are trying to do their due diligence and say, well, we would like your comment on the story. Can we come out and talk to you? No, I'm afraid. I'm afraid to speak because of retribution from the organization. This is an anonymous call. I don't want to have nothing to do with that. And that would be, we wouldn't have the same person doing it. We have different people doing it. So it would seem like a neighborhood's outraged. And now all of a sudden the media is covering a story because we back then twisted the narrative and got the attention.
What you've said is particularly enlightening, in the sense that when Talkback radio began, or talk radio, when in the States, it provided people with the opportunity to communicate more broadly and engage. That opportunity is, shall we say, agnostic. People can be, the opportunity is open to anybody. But movements like the NSM appear, from what you said, to have used it effectively.
Yeah, I mean, that's one thing. The NSM was incredibly. I mean, my skill set. I don't want to say we were good at it, because there's nothing good about having been involved in this stuff, but very good with propaganda for everything from music to videos to podcasts. Later on, podcasts, phone hotline messages, starting in the '90s up until, I'm sure, currently. Um, Video games later on, anything you could think of, bands, parroting the music, any kind of propaganda, magazines, newsletters. Some of the other groups had newspapers back in those days, and we would get bulk order the newspapers and then stick our flyers in them, and pass the throw those into neighborhood yards and things like that. So it was. And then of course the internet, when that we were early on in the internet, one of the earlier organizations that had a website, so we were pretty on top of a lot of those different things. Unfortunately, got pretty good at it.
Now, one of the other issues is branding. Um, what role did sort of uniforms and dress have in the organisation, in terms of branding, in terms of drawing attention to what it was doing?
Branding was very important as far as symbolism, um, looking for on the street activism. It wasn't as controlled in the earlier days, but later on it got more tighter or more concise. So the uniforms, the look, symbolism, all that sort of thing was very important because with branding, people know that look, they know they know the organization's symbols, the organization's flags. um so that was a big deal. So the branding and the public perception, and there was a couple of changes over the years in that. In 2008, there was a branding change that was done where the organization, going back to George Lincoln Rockwell and the original American Nazi Party, they wore that brown shirt uniform, the old school, like the German stormtroopers did. And over the years, people were saying to me and saying at events, like, "Hey, I would like to join, or I want to be involved in this, but I'm not German." And it was something that we kept hearing over and over and over again. And I kept thinking, well, why do people think you have to be German to be involved in this? um, if there's so many that believe that, we're doing something wrong with the branding. We shouldn't be using these old uniforms. So in 2008, rebranded to all black battle dress uniforms, BDUs. So that was one thing in the branding. Then we stopped using the German flags and things like that, used specifically NSM symbols with the red, white, and blue of the American flags. And at that time, we were still using the swastika. In 2016, the swastika was replaced with a odal rune, and in another rebranding attempt there in 2016.
Now, one of the interesting elements in this is when you're engaged in street activism, um, there are groups that argue that you need to keep yourself um, hidden. You need to mask up. You need to keep your identity hidden. When you do a rebrand of a uniform and you're looking at sort of mass recruitment and whatever else, yeah, it looks impressive um, from a visual standpoint, which is probably what you were aiming at with
Yep.
black, etc.
Yep.
But what does that do from the point of view of getting attention from, yeah, the friends in law enforcement?
Well, I guess it definitely got a lot of law enforcement attention. Everything from being raided by the authorities to leaders of the organization getting knocks at the doors from different law enforcement agencies and things like that. And of course, because we weren't hiding our faces, we were open. Um, when the doxing and things like that started, a lot of people, and just in general, with people getting recognized or people doing demonstrations in their local areas got recognized, but especially the spokespeople, the ones that were giving speeches or talking to the media and stuff like that, they were um, the more high profile you were, the more high profile, more problems, as far as that goes. But yes, having that disciplined, organized look was important, um, for the public's perception. And one thing that I had noticed and early on is I'd watched a program on. I think it was on HBO or something, but it was a program that was covering a movement group, and this was in the 90s, and it showed this small group of them. There might have been 12 guys in marching, but it looked like, from the overhead aerial view and seeing these guys march, it looked like they had 2 dozen. I couldn't figure that at first. I'm looking at it, I go, why does it look like they have twice as many guys as they do? Why is that? Why am I seeing that visually? And what was noticeable was most of those guys, or all of those guys, were carrying flags. So because they had poles and flags, and the way the media's eye or the camera's eye is looking at this, it looks like double the numbers. So that from that day going forward, we made sure to have more flags and more poles because we wanted to look larger and more imposing than we even were.
One of the, um, I guess, if we can touch on your relationship with the media when you pulled the plug, left the movement in 2019. What was the shift like between uh, after 27 years in the movement and then sort of engaging with the media when you were ready to engage late in 2019, if I remember rightly?
Yeah, it was in. I started talking to the media again in it was August or September of 2019 after leaving in early March of 2019. So that was it was interesting, I guess you could say. Everybody has different opinions, so some reporters were really supportive. I had run into or had talks with some that had covered me before that still had my phone number and reached out and were like, oh wow, what you're doing now is incredible, and some were very supportive. And then there's other people that are, not so much now, but at first that were kind of skeptical. Maybe they didn't believe me, or were skeptical, or would ask different people that didn't know me or didn't know about the work that I was doing. What do you think about this guy? And there's people that after being in the movement for 27 years, I understand it. It's frustrating, of course, but I understand it, and it's reasonable to question anyone, I guess, that after so long changes their viewpoints and things like that. But a colleague in academia had said to me once, he says, I'm not going to ask you any questions about what you stand for now, or excuse me, that are you the same as before? Do you believe in the same things? He says, because nobody questioned you when you were a Nazi and you spoke and believed in it. No one questioned that. So why now would anybody question what you say? So how is it okay to believe you before, but now not believe you? It doesn't make sense. And I thought, hey, that's an interesting way of looking at it. But I like that because he was right. Nobody was questioning my beliefs. I mean, my beliefs were wrong, but the sincerity of where stood before, no one was questioning that. So how would they question it now? I thought that was interesting psychologically.
It is an interesting point you make in terms of transition, what the perception is, and how people grapple with that, and how you, as far as I can tell from the material I've read so far, how you then build a presence that indicates a progression, which is an interesting process. Back to the media more generally, we have a debate here from time to time about uh, whether you platform extremists or what you do in covering extremist activity. Based on your experience, which is considerable, um, uh, what do you believe is the best approach for people to take when they're confronted with a news story that deals with um, extremist activity?
It's a really good question, and it's a difficult one because I know that the media here, Australia, and across the world, a lot of people struggle with that on what is the right answer to that. And I can say, with coming from my experience, that I can give a few examples. But one thing on the more extreme end, okay, so when you have an extremist that's going out and doing mass shootings like the guy in New Zealand, and I'm not even going to name him, and I'm going to explain why, um, and other instances here in the United States and Pittsburgh and a number of other places where people walked into synagogues, mosques, churches, and started pulling the trigger. There are elements, the most extreme elements of the far right movement, that uphold these people as martyrs or heroes, or that they've sacrificed, to for a greater cause. And the idea behind these thinkers and the people that think like them and support them is that they do these actions in hopes of triggering something. I mean, this even goes back to like Charlie Manson and his people, where they were trying to start a race war. They were trying to kick off a race war. This is what these people are attempting to do by doing those actions. They don't think that that one action is going to win the war per se, but they're doing that to get the attention, to make martyrs of themselves, or they believe that they're going to be a martyr. Um, Similar to the like Islamic extremists that are doing things
Mhm.
like that. But the difference is, typically with the Islamic extremist, they have no problem with sacrificing their life. With the white supremacist or far right extremists or far left that are not of that religious ideology, those extremists tend to, sometimes they are killed in these actions, but more often they're not, because they have this belief that one day these groups are going to come to power, they're going to be let out, that sort of thing. But they're trying to build up that reputation. So the first bit of advice I guess I would have for the media would be, don't name them. You can I mean, obviously it's news, you have to cover those stories about what those tragedies, but don't name them. And specifically, you could even say, like, we are not giving this person a platform, we're not going to give their movement a platform, don't name them. That would be my advice there. And I know there's probably ethical concerns that different departments or different governments might have on that, but I think that would be an easy step in the right direction, is just to simply not name that individual. Make don't
No,
give
not
them.
even not so. Even when an individual goes to court, they're in front of a courtroom. Um, you would argue that in front of a just testing the theory in in a public in a public sort of forum like a court where they're being tried and then found guilty of doing what they've done. You would argue that they during the legal process their name shouldn't be used, would you?
You see, that's a complexity. I mean, on one hand, you want to say, okay, well, I guess you wouldn't have to name him there either, him or her, but you could say the individual that did this terror attack or whatever it was sentenced
Okay.
to 50 years. I think it's tough. It's tough. It's
Oh,
a tough
it's a difficult issue,
one.
um, and one where I've observed it here, and when I've written copy on Christchurch, I've actually asked editors, "Do you want me to include the name of the individual? Do you want me to leave it out, or did you want me to name a certain Telegram channel or leave it out? Do you want me to obscure it? Just say it's a far right channel. What did you want me to do? What approach do you want me to have?" Um, uh, so not naming extremists in that in a general sense is where you would go. What's the next thing? Because we've got to cover we've got to cover the events, and not giving them martyr status is one element of it.
Yep.
But that doesn't deal with the entire problem. It just means that you're um, sidestepping naming someone that is probably doing it for the one, the attention, and two, you're right, the acceleration, seeking to accelerate a conflict,
Yes.
which is
Yeah.
where
So
groups like Atomwaffen Division and Base, and a range of others that operate across Europe are at.
yeah, exactly. Now, with the other organizations that tend to stay political, legal for the most part, and things like that, organization like I was a part of, the National Socialist Movement, and I keep naming it just for posterity's sake. But one way of looking at that for those type of organizations, you could go back to that and not name them and just say a far right or extremist group was out there. I know if I put myself back in the seat of where I was in the past in the NSM, had the media covered us and not named us, and you didn't see the NSM flags with the name on them or things like that, it would have been a fail, because if people didn't know who we were to look us up on the internet or write us or call us, it would have been more difficult. And people's, and this goes back to propaganda, but people's attention span, especially in this day and age with social media and instant news at your fingertips and all that, people's attention spans are very short. So if they've got to spend 15 minutes to try to figure out, well, what group was this that had a march in Dallas today or in Las Vegas or wherever, they're going to forget about it and they're not going to look it up. So that's one quick little thing that might help. But another thing, and I think this is kind of important too, and I think a lot of the listenership might find this interesting as well. Um, uh, Tom, on the last program, did I mention about the rally where no media showed up, or should I talk about that?
I think no, I don't think we covered that on the record. So have a stab at that one because that's an interesting story.
Yeah, it was really interesting, and this was actually in, I believe it was in Biloxi, Mississippi. Um, Maybe I got the city wrong, but it was in Mississippi, and a few years back, and it was NSM and the Ku Klux Klan rallying together, and there was almost no audience at that. There wasn't a lot of press or any press. There was basically just a handful of people from the local area that were around there. No counter protesters, no supporters, just basically almost an empty rally. And the reason I bring this story up is because the morale of the people that were there, both from NSM and the KKK, was very low. It was like people were saying, "Oh, this was the most boring rally that we've ever done. This was horrible. It was bad." And as the leader of the organization at the time, I'm thinking, "Oh no, this is not good. If this gets around in the group, or they didn't enjoy this or didn't have a good time, this is going to hurt our numbers in the future," is where I was thinking at the time. I was really worried about it. I was like, man, if this is the future of rallies, we're done because people won't show up. So that, I think, psychologically tells a lot about where this stuff goes, because it was only a year or two before that where there was a big fight with Antifa at a rally in New Jersey, and turned into this big street fight, and that sent the morale skyrocketing. There was people that missed it and said, "I will never miss another rally again. I saw the video from fighting the Antifa. I'm going to be there. I'm embarrassed that I wasn't there fighting with you guys," things like that. And there was comments coming from people after that Mississippi rally going, "Why couldn't this have been like New Jersey? I wish we could have gotten into a big fight again," or things like that. And I have to explain that as well, that the NSM, when I was there, was not allowed to strike or attack anyone. In all those years, there was never anyone arrested at a rally because the regulations were very strict with the NSM, where you could not hit someone and you could only fight in self-defense. So if you were attacked, then you could fight, but the other side had to attack first, and that's typically what happens. So when there would be violent clashes, it was instigated by the other side.
Hmm. It's an interesting one. I mean, it, listening to your solutions or the ways in which to sort of minimize the growth also leads me to reflect on um, how you report responsibly more broadly and get people to understand the consequences of going down that pathway. And I guess doing what we're doing now, having a dialogue with people who've been there, is one way of doing it. Um, what, how important is the role of case studies, in your view, to trying to get people to think more deeply about, making sure they don't go down an extremist route?
From preventing it in the first place, is that what you're asking?
Correct.
Oh, there's so many different things, but I believe that it really starts with prevent is more important, I think, even than getting people out. Getting people out is important as well, but if we can prevent people from getting in, then we don't have to tackle that issue later on in the future. So to prevent, the best policy, I believe, is starting young in the school systems and proper education, because a lot of what these extremist groups believe, it's groupthink, it's a cult like mentality. It becomes your truth or your reality, even though it's not the truth. It becomes your truth, it becomes your reality, even though it's not what it's not reality, but that's how you start to think. And a lot of that is based on fear of the unknown, misunderstandings, misinterpretations, not knowing, or the people that are around you, or the different aspects of race and ethnicity and humanity and religion and all these sorts of things. So I think if we start young in the schools and we have programs. When I was in school, they had something called like International Day or International Festival or something like that. And it was one day of the year, and it was a lot of fun, but it mainly focused on like, okay, well, here's food samples from Germany, here's food samples from Mexico, here's food samples from this sort of thing. And it was a lot of fun, but it was just one day. And I don't think that's enough. I think if we're starting and we have a class, and one week you're studying Kenya, next week you're studying France, or next day you can go through all these different things and cover the different religions and stuff too. So people don't have all these stereotypes or these fears or worries about the so-called other. They can't be othering people when they realize the other is just like them, just a little bit different.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most significant lesson that you learn from looking at these issues is that people bleed and breed like each other, and any differences are there to perpetuate either an absence of understanding, or a deliberate attempt by people to divide and conquer. Well, that's how it
Absolutely.
seems.
Yeah, absolutely.
Jeff, I'm very mindful of the time. You've been extremely generous again. For that, I'm grateful. For people who didn't tune into the first one, where did they find your the websites? You've got one for Beyond Barriers, and you've got the personal one. Could you give those details again?
Yes, Beyond Barriers USA.org is the nonprofit organization that we operate, that helps people to get out of extremism, and we help educate the public and speak out and do good work and peace building. And my personal website is jeffschoep.com. That's JEFFSCHOEP.com. Those are our websites, and encourage people to reach out and get in touch with us.
Jeff, and it's been great to talk to you again a second time. Hopefully, we'll get to do this again, a third or a fourth and a fifth. But look, thank you so much for taking the time out to talk about your experiences and some of the things media could do better.
Thank you for having me.
Absolute pleasure.